Hello and welcome to the lecture on Principles of Training for Dance. This lecture will be in two parts. The first lecture will discuss the principles of training and the components of physical fitness. And the second lecture will go on and discuss more in-depth look at strength and conditioning. Now, we know dance is unique. Dance, as opposed to other sports, needs enhanced levels of all components. The aesthetic nature means that increased flexibility, strength, endurance, neuromuscular control are all equally important. We're not just talking about strength like you might need to kick a ball. As we know, in football, it doesn't need to be aesthetically pleasing. Now, we can look at maybe gymnastics because we use a lot of that literature, gymnastics and sports, especially the aesthetic sports literature. However, one thing that does make us different is the aesthetic and the artistic. But at the moment, today we'll be mainly looking at those different components. So we'll be looking at flexibility, strength, endurance, neuromuscular control, and the principles of dance. Now, the components of physical fitness, of course, are strength, flexibility, neuromuscular coordination, cardiovascular training, very important for us. And we'll be looking at how the training and the body requires a systematic use of progressive and repetitive exercises to build that cardiovascular, musculoskeletal, and nervous systems. Now, physical fitness, Williams tells us, that can be defined as the individual's ability to meet the demands of a specific physical task. Its components, as we've just discussed above, include aerobic and anaerobic. Now, if you don't know the different terms about aerobic and anaerobic, aerobic means how long, and in talking about endurance training. So how long can we run on a treadmill? If we run an hour, we're building up endurance, aerobic training. Anaerobic means very fast, 30 seconds. Now, classical dancers, for example, a male dancer's classical ballet variation, which lasts about 45 seconds, is anaerobic. So a lot of the times, classical ballet dancers are not actually training their aerobic capacity, but their anaerobic capacity. So we have to be very, very careful of that in our training. Of course, then there's muscular strength, which we've just discussed, power, joint mobility, and muscle flexibility, and of course, body composition, which means we all have different body types. For example, we can just look at genders. Between the sexes, male and female, we have very different body types. We have over 600 muscles with 206 bones, countless ligaments and tendons in the body. So when we're discussing about dancers, it's really nearly impossible for a dancer to go through all their career not to have an injury. Now, these can be either acute or they can be repetitive. Now, acute means spraining the ankle, falling over and breaking something, or spraining your wrists, or repetitive stress associated with dance activities means that something that we keep doing over and over again, like jumping. If we're doing lots of jumping, we'll get repetitive stress, maybe in arthritis in our knees if we're not strong enough, or talking about classical ballet dancers, because of the rotation en dehors, they often get arthritis in the hips. But we know that we can combat that now through dance science. So the aim of strength training, now we've been talking about strength training, is actually to train the nervous system. By training the appropriate neural pathways, dancers will be able to activate a larger percentage of their musculature during a particular action. Now, neuromuscular actually is talking about that pathway, the meeting of the nerve and in the muscle fiber. So neuromuscular transmission is the transfer of information to the nerve to the muscle. Now, this will be discussed quite a bit during the dance science course because how the muscle fires, if it fires quick or it fires slow, it's different for different people. Dance training. A dancer, to gain strength, must progressively and gradually stress the body towards the upper limits of capacity in order to improve. Now, to do this, in which the duration, how long, intensity, how much, and frequency, how many times, are manipulated to produce the overall overload. Now, this is very important. So let's just quickly go over what overloading means. So the principles of overload is to tax the system to a certain threshold and then push it a little bit more in order to find the right stimulus to improve strength. Now, we could also be talking about endurance, overloading and building endurance. But strength and endurance are two different things, and we'll discuss a little bit about that. So when we're looking at overload, now we're talking about here, of course, the load, resistance, and how much we put onto that resistance. Now, this can be done by using weights when you want to build up strength, but it can be also done by repeating something until a marked fatigue level is produced by the last repetition. So if we want to build up endurance in a dance class and we just do 8 jumps, maybe we'll be working on the technique of the jump. But then if we want to build up endurance, we need to do more than 8. So we start to build, of course. Now, if I'm starting to build up endurance, I want to start to build up aerobic capacity. And how would I do that in class? Instead of just doing 8, I might do 16 times 8 bars of jumping. So to build that aerobic capacity up in the dancers. Now, we also talk about, of course, periodize the training in overload. So when are we going to use that overload? Are we going to do it all the way through the year? Now, if I was looking at a performance schedule, a competition for dancers or performance schedule for some dancers, I'd be looking at when to overload them and when to not overload them. I wouldn't want to be overloading them while they're doing their performances. I'd want to be overload and preparing them, and then during the performance taking that overload off. Now, to overload and build strength, we usually do need resistance training, RT in short. Now, this can be done by lifting weights, or resistance bands are really great for dancers. So we have to think that assigning the right load, repetition, and exercise frequency to rehabilitate strength is very different to rehabilitate endurance or power. So that is quite important to understand the difference between endurance training and strength training. So when you're building a program for your dancers, make sure that usually what we need to do is build strength. We're talking about deliberate practice, building technique and building that strength, and then go on and building endurance. So let's talk about specificity. Now, the principle of specificity recommends that in order to develop motor abilities, the exercise or the training exercise, you should use similar technical patterns and kinematic structures to tailor that particular activity for which the dancer is preparing for. So for example, if I'm going to be working on Grand Pliés in that Russian dance that I was talking about, Nutcracker, I'll be using the same technical patterns. So it's going down quickly and going up quickly. So I would be putting the barbell on the dancer, maybe with a little bit of weights, and working on squats. Now starting, of course, off small weights, but trying to find that maximum weight that the dancer can have. And as I said before, we will discuss how to do that in our next lecture. So let's move on to those dance-specific programs. So as I just mentioned, the load should be heavy enough so that they cannot perform another repetition. So if they're going to do 5, they shouldn't be able to perform 6. It should burn and be quite hard. So once they get to that desired number, the repetition's maximum principle. So if you want to improve strength, you should assign a rep range of about 3 to 5 repetitions. So meaning that the dancer should not be able to lift another repetition, so 6. And how you usually do that is that you get to about 70% of the maximum weight the dancer can lift. So you ask them to do it once, and if it's too easy, you say, oh, is that too easy? Yes, oh, too easy. Let's make it more difficult. And you get up to the point where the dancer can't lift it anymore, and then you bring that weight down about 30%. So it's about 70 to 80% of the maximum weight dancer, and that's what is called the repetition's maximum principle. So let's talk about resistance training. So there are 3 types of resistance training. So isometrics, isotonics, and plyometrics. Isometrics is static muscle contraction where no movement occurs. So the best way to work in isometrics, since it's static muscle, it's just static muscle contraction, is to actually hold it at different heights. So if I'm going to do a bicep curl and to actually hold it maybe a little bit bent, then 25 degrees and then 45 degrees. So it works at different angles. Now, then there's also isotonics, and this works very well with resistance training. So going down and going up through the movement. So we go through that range of motion with the resistance. And then there is plyometrics, which develops explosive power using rigorous exercises such as jumps, hops, and skips and jumps. And there is a small video that we'll just look at now that talks about working with classical ballet dancers, ballerinas, working on plyometrics. Let's have a look. So let's have a quick look at Casper Stadler, who talks about using plyometrics when working with classical ballet ballerinas. You can find this link in the reference list if you would like to watch the whole video.
Their leg strength and power, their acceleration, balance, and also their bone density. The benefit of broad jumps to dancers is that it improves the reaction of fast-twitch muscle fibers throughout their body. Like other plyometric exercises, effective broad jumps require your leg and core muscles to contract very quickly, so you can generate maximal force with each leap and jump. This will directly translate into higher, faster, and more powerful allegro in ballet class. The next plyometric exercise we are doing in this training session is depth jumps. This is to develop the girls' speed and explosiveness and improve their stretch reflex. When the girls step from the box and briefly free fall to the ground, they end up violently springing up off of the ground and landing onto the bench. It is a bit like when you throw a rubber ball at the floor and it explodes backwards into the air. This sharp impact with the floor quickly triggers the girls' bodies to absorb the impact and redirect the pull of gravity to a max effort vertical jump with minimal time spent on the floor. This minimal ground contact time with maximum power output is key to speed, explosiveness, and change of direction in dance. In the short term, the depth jump leads to a higher jump than performing just a regular vertical jump because the athlete is absorbing momentum and kinetic energy and using it on the rebound jump. Research indicates that dropping from around 30 inches leads to the greatest explosive strength and reactive abilities. A dancer would benefit most from these heights, as higher heights are more for maximal strength development. Next, we are doing seated box jumps. The seated box jump is one of my favorite training tools because it does a great job of eliminating the stretch reflex prior to jumping. This is the opposite to what we are training when we are doing depth jumps. By eliminating the stretch reflex, you're training the concentric muscle action exclusively. This gives your lower body a new challenge compared to the depth jumps. As you can see, the girls sit on the bench and explode into a box jump. Try to eliminate all rocking before the jump, and you have a great tool for developing starting explosive strength in dancers. We have now finished with the plyometric portion of the workout.
You would have heard Caspar talk about ROAM. Now, ROAM is an acronym for range of motion. So, of course, to get optimum performance, we have to use a full range of motion. So if we're going to work at isotonics, we work in the full range of motion with resistance. Now, isometric training, of course, does not use range of motion, doesn't go through that range of motion. So we have to make sure that we stretch a little bit. So we use some active stretching techniques after we do isometrics. Please make sure that it is not passive stretching, and we'll talk about that difference later on. So let's move on and talk about eccentric, concentric, and isometric. So here we can see in the picture, when you are concentrically activating the muscle, if you're using the bicep and you're bending the weight up towards you, that is concentric. Now, if I am then taking it back down and going through that range of motion and taking the weight back down, it's eccentrically activating the muscle. Now, if I'm holding it in that place in 45 degrees, then it's isometrically activating that muscle. So we have eccentric, concentric, and isometric.
Our subject will be performing 3 different muscle actions: concentric, eccentric, and isometric. Concentric muscle actions occur when a muscle shortens to produce force and movement. Again, take the bicep for example. To move this weight, the bicep must shorten, produce force, and create the movement of elbow flexion. So this would be a concentric muscle action. Concentric muscle actions can be described with the simple equation: force is greater than resistance. With eccentric muscle actions, the muscle lengthens, producing force and resisting the weight. So in this case, using the biceps as the example, we begin in elbow flexion. To lower the weight under control, it's necessary for the biceps to fire eccentrically to lower the weight under control. Eccentric muscle actions can be described with the simple equation: force is less than resistance. Isometric muscle actions occur when the muscle produces force, but the force is equivalent to the resistance, therefore there is no movement and no shortening of the muscle. So again, in this example, to hold this weight in this position during elbow flexion, the bicep is contracting isometrically in order to prevent the movement. Isometric muscle actions can be described with the simple equation: force equals resistance.
Let's talk about reversibility. Now, reversibility is talking about detraining and deconditioning. So once you're working, or once overload is discontinued, or once training is discontinued, reversibility starts to happen. Now, Nureyev used to say this used to happen, he could feel it after 1 week. Now, it's usually between 2 to 4 weeks of stopping training that usually there is a marked and significant loss of performance. So the intensity of detraining depends on, of course, the muscle, age, fitness, length of training, and body type. Cardiovascular conditioning usually declines most quickly, and then afterwards comes strength and conditioning. So the principles of training reversibility states that a stopped, reduced training induces a partial or complete reversal of the previous developed adaptations, thus compromising performance. The reversibility principle is known as detraining, and the concept of detraining refers to the total or partial loss of the training-induced adaptation achieved through training. Now, even though there's times during one's career or dance career, and this usually coincides with having time off, injury, detraining happens, the loss of physical activity is not comparable to the restriction of the current confinement, that stay at home that we're all in. So detraining is one of the biggest negative consequences of our forced quarantine for our performers. I can see this just in myself, just during bar. And if you watched videos from Dan's Head where I teach in the beginning of lockdown, I can actually get through bar. Now I can hardly get through a bar, and I can only show on one side. So I can feel myself, my actual strength has gone. Talking about my cardiovascular work, I've actually got back on the treadmill, but actually I can feel that strength, so I need to go back and do some strength training. So detraining affects different physiological systems, the neuromuscular, so our coordination, cardiovascular, respiratory, and musculoskeletal. And of course their corresponding physical capacities, strength and power, endurance, speed and flexibility. It's very interesting. So we're talking about reversibility, and very much during this time I think this is a big problem for all our performers. We've talked a lot about strength. So strength is important as it gives control to dance movements and prevents injury. So there needs to be a balance between strength and flexibility, very much yin and yang. So there are factors affecting strength levels. Strength is simply the ability to exert force, and the weight that a person can lift is probably the oldest quantitative measure of strength. Given the individual differences in the ability to exert force at different speeds, perhaps a more inclusive definition of strength is the maximum force that the muscle group can generate at a specified velocity. But we need to look, because the several factors can affect strength levels. Of course, these affect age, like I just discussed my own. I'm 50 years old. I haven't really taught class since March. Usually I'd be teaching maybe 20 hours a week, but now I'm actually not teaching hardly at all, maybe 2 hours at maximum. Gender. We need generally, women are approximately 50 to 70% as strong as men in the upper and lower body respectively. So we need to make sure that we look at that. The greater gender difference is in upper body strength, and that can be attributed to the fact that women tend to have a lower proportion of their lean muscle distributed in the upper body. Men are also stronger relative to lean body mass, probably that's due to their large muscle fibers. And the presence of testosterone, that male sex hormone, may account for this difference. So in contrast, women have low levels of testosterone, making muscle fiber diameter growth harder to achieve. So this needs to be very careful. That is another factor. There's also muscle fiber type, and dance type and seniority, how your age again. So for example, at a professional level, so we're looking at a classical ballet company, classical ballet soloists demonstrate significantly greater power capacities compared to principal and quarter ballet dancers, who in turn have significantly greater aerobic capabilities. So soloist ballerinas are also characterized by higher muscular strength, which is normal when you look at the work they're doing. So of course then there's nutritional factors, which you will have a lecture on that, body temperature and times of year. So there are several factors that can affect different strength levels. Let's talk about power. So power is needed for explosive movements such as fast allegro steps or very fast steps. We need that power to push off the floor, and that plyometric training is very good for that. So power is the explosive, speed-relative aspect of strength, which in turn is the ability to produce force. So when we're talking about power, it's about the ability to produce force explosively, so very quickly. So Rafferty states that the amount of force generated by a single contraction and the speed at which this power is generated. So when we're talking about power, it's very much like this. So let's just quickly go over. We're talking about power, we're talking about flexibility. Now flexibility is the mobility and the range of motion of a joint. neuromuscular coordination, which involves balance, coordination, and skill. Now, a body composition relates to the makeup of body weight by percentage of muscle and fat, and we've just discussed that, the difference between the genders. But each component should be awarded equal importance. I'll repeat that. Each component should be awarded equal importance, because a common error of dancers is to emphasize flexibility but neglect strength and other conditioning components such as cardiovascular work. So we have to be very careful that dancers get so focused on flexibility, especially in classical ballet, Chinese classical dance. So there's lots of that focus there, and we need to be very careful that there's all the other components when we're talking about the principles of dance training. So let's just quickly go on and talk about muscular endurance, because we've been discussing about endurance, the difference between endurance and strength training. So endurance means how many times a muscle can produce force against a particular resistance. Now, usually this is high repetitions with a low resistance. So we do that a lot in class, just like jumping. So let's say do 16 jumps. We're building endurance. Now, as opposed to strength training, which we've been discussing all the way through this lecture, that is trained with high resistance and low repetitions. So technique classes often focus on neuromuscular coordination and exercises for muscular endurance and flexibility. Of course, that varies between different genres and, of course, what the teacher is focusing on. But the problem is, a lot of the time, the length of the class is really not adequate to meet all the conditioning needs of a dancer. Let's quickly just go over the principles of training. Specificity, the specificity of the training intervention, what actually we want to improve, where are they weakest, what is the hardest step, as I mentioned about the Russian dance in Nutcracker. Overload, assigning a training regime of heavier intensity that a dancer is accustomed to, and then progression, to understand how that dancer is progression in building that strength or building the endurance. The specificity of a training program will elicit improvements in specific outcomes. So what it's making us do as practitioners is it's making us ask, what do we want to achieve with the dancer for that specific piece they are doing? Now, that means actually maybe they are weak in an area where they need strengthening, or the actual piece is so demanding that we know that that dancer will need more strength or more endurance. So as a guide from a muscle rehabilitation perspective, the muscles can be categorized into muscle performance or functionality, and this can be categorized into three types: muscle strength, muscle power, and muscle endurance. We've come to the end of the first part of this lecture. I'm sorry it's been a little bit too long, and I hope that you found it interesting. Here is the reference list. You will find the link to the video that we watched on plyometrics, so please go and have a look at that, because I think it's quite good. There is a book on this reference list that you cannot get in an ebook, sadly. It's The Science of Dance Training from Clarkson and Scriner. However, I just looked on Amazon and you can get it for under $7. So it's actually quite a good book if you can grab that book. It's a small book and less expensive than the others, and it's very good. There is some other readings. Please read the Rafferty, the Schummel, and the Williams, those papers, and because we will have some tasks at the end of the next lecture, and I think those readings will help you in those tasks. If you're interested about strategies and solutions re-COVID, have a look at the paper from Zurich. Even though it is talking about team sports, there are some aspects of that paper that can be applied to us and deliberate practice. Thank you.